There we go. Good morning, Dog Nation. I'm Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Meriwether Tharp. Looking forward to 1st and 15. Sorry, running a couple minutes late, but glad to have you with us. Busy, fun show for us. It includes Terrence Edwards here coming up in just a couple of minutes. But first, though, it's your turn. Greater discretion in the commentary, the direction of our discussion. You get wider leeway with all that right now as part of our 1st and 15 here right now. So we'll dive in here, we'll get it going, and we'll see how you're all doing here today. Let's get some comments up and running. Lee Burkett checking in from St. Augustine. Beautiful part of our country, and Lee, we're glad to have you as a part of the show here today. Randy Hall wondering about some of these big games, Ohio State, Notre Dame, Florida State, and Clemson. We'll give you our official picks as a part of Go With The Flow on Friday, but I don't mind giving you a little bit of a tip on this here right now. I like Ohio State, and I like Florida State. And in the case of Florida State there, I think the ultimate difference maker is going to be the play of the Florida State wide receivers. I think that Clemson is kind of sneaky underrated here at the moment. We all saw them, of course, in the first Monday night of the season, that Labor Day night game, really kind of getting embarrassed by Duke, and that's the memory that's etched in our skulls because of that. But the truth is, against lesser competition in games that really, unless you're a Clemson fan, you probably didn't watch, Clemson's kind of figuring some things out. They're playing a little bit better. It seems like Klubnik's kind of getting settled in there a bit. Clemson is not going to be, a total flop as a team, even though they flopped in that game against Duke on that particular Monday night. So while I don't really think we're kind of in the Dabo-Sweeney era in terms of Clemson being a perennial playoff contender anymore, I don't believe that's the case. I do believe that Clemson can still be a pretty dangerous team. I believe they are dangerous against Florida State here on Saturday, but ultimately I believe that Florida State wins because I think the Clemson defense, which is not quite the same as it was when it was led by Brent Venables, I think it has a hard time with Keon Coleman, those Florida State wide receivers. And I think for Clemson, who does not have that same caliber of receiver in its own program anymore, not only do they have a hard time slowing down what Florida State wants to do offensively, I think they have a hard time matching that on their side of the ball there, too. Obviously, we saw Florida State scuffle last week against Boston College. Maybe that's the wake-up call that gives you some certainty about what Florida State can do here. Keep in mind, Seminoles haven't beaten Clemson the last 7 tries. They're just 2-5 against the spread over that span there as well. So keep that in mind. But ultimately, it's a game in which I like Florida State. And on the Ohio State Notre Dame side, the thing that concerns you a little bit about picking Ohio State here is Buckeyes' offensive line has not been great. We didn't expect it to be. Notre Dame very quietly has put a very good running game effort. All the attention that Sam Hartman gets at quarterback, but very quietly, Irish have been very good on the ground there as well. So that gives you a little bit of pause here. But ultimately, I think that Ohio State probably wins the game, probably maybe even somewhat convincingly, and probably emerges out of the season's not quite first month. We got one more Saturday after this, but nearing the end of the first month as probably the most hyped team of the true national contenders. We've kind of had a quiet landscape as far as the true national contenders go. Not just Georgia, but Michigan's been quiet. Alabama seems to be kind of unraveling here a bit. Ohio State really hasn't really played what I would think of as kind of a great game yet. Even perhaps a very good game. I don't know that the Buckeyes have done that. But on Saturday's the day when I believe that's going to change for somebody. And I think that Ohio State probably emerges as getting a lot of attention when it's all said and done. Philip Thomas says, I love the locker room clips from SEC Inside. I could watch Kirby all day. I thought that video was so incredibly well done. And obviously we would all agree with that. But I believe there's a little extra something going on here where this video is, in my mind, going like excessively viral. And I actually went and looked at the SEC Network on Twitter to see how many video views it had gotten, to the extent that we even take that as a real number. And the overall video views were not actually quite as high as I thought they might be. This morning it was like 660,000 on Twitter. That's higher than some of the recent videos the SEC networks put out, but not like dramatically higher necessarily than some of their more substantial videos. And so, numerically, I don't know that matches the level of virality that I think this clip has sort of had. Georgia fans everywhere are talking about this, everywhere. We talked about it yesterday. We're going to talk some more about it on the show here coming up in a moment, a specific moment from within the video that's kind of getting some attention now. But this sort of feels like it's got the makings of something, the kind of thing that, a lot of folks have compared Kirby Smart himself even the South Carolina game to the Missouri game a year ago, different scenario from the standpoint that we'd already seen Georgia play very well as a team prior to stubbing its toe almost against Missouri. So maybe a different level of confidence for last year's team compared to this year's team. But nonetheless, that's the comparison that's going to be made. In terms of the kind of, be careful, you won the game, but you had to escape, and that becomes the sort of thing you can build on. I think this video in a roundabout way sort of helps Georgia do it. And I don't know that Kirby Smart could have portrayed himself as a coach any better than he did off the cuff in that moment. It's a little bit like we talked about the Deion Sanders post-game speech after the TCU game when he was like, doing whatever, and then at the end he goes like, hey, and play my music or whatever it was that he said. Like off the cuff, you can't do much better than that in terms of delivering a message. Well, Kirby Smart showed you on Saturday night, as he's done many times in the past, that he is certainly more than capable of being able to do that too. So I thought it was really cool, and I get the impression this may have a little staying power here for Georgia. I get the impression there may be something that Georgia can do to build off of that. Johnny Surfdog says, I don't see the same number of draft prospects this year as in the past 2 years. The past 2 years, teams were historically stacked. You could be right about that, Johnny. Maybe that'll be the case. I think some of that's too early to decide. I think there are defensive guys in particular that are in the midst of possibly emerging that we haven't fully seen yet. So I'm going to withhold judgment on how good some of all of that is until we see ultimately how this team comes together. I think that's maybe partially true on the offensive line there too. This is an offensive line. We're going to talk more about this also in a moment. This is a group that's very much in flux right now. But, you can find some real winners for you among that group. I think you've got some defensive guys that have not quite fully stepped to the forefront the way that they might. And when it's all said and done, I think you're going to probably see a similar level of top-end NFL talent from the draft-eligible guys, from the guys who are a little bit younger than that. My assumption is that eventually that cream is going to rise to the top, but we probably haven't seen it as of yet. Let's see what else is going on here. Johnny Surfdog also checking in from Jacksonville Beach, Florida, which is another beautiful area in the country. Brian Whitehead said to ask Terrence Edwards about the reason for the lack of deep shots by Beck. Is he playing not to make a mistake? So we will talk more about that here in a moment. We also talked to Jake Fromm about that pretty extensively yesterday, too. So, Brian, if you missed that from yesterday, you can go back and hear Jake Fromm discussing that very topic. Johnny Prescott says, I confide in very few people. My barber, my pastor, my bartender, and you. Well, there you go, Johnny. I consider that to be very good company, so I appreciate that. Thank you very much. DT on the subject of Ohio State, still whining about Marvin Harrison's injury in the game against Georgia in the Peach Bowl. Yeah, we're going to briefly mention that here a little bit later on. Ohio State athletic director Gene Smith, and it was quoted by Ross Dellinger, the reporter for, who does he work for now? I'm not even sure anymore. But anyway, Yahoo maybe. But the point is that I'm not even sure what the context was that Gene Smith spoke this in. But, yeah, they have not given up on that. And it's kind of interesting. We're going to get into this before we're done today. Both sides of the game on Saturday, that's the biggest of them all, the really big game between Ohio State and Notre Dame, weirdly, both sides are kind of talking about Georgia right now, which gives you a little bit of indication of just how important Georgia's become. It even cast a pretty large shadow on the weekend's top game. Diedrich Frazier says, I am very excited to see this Georgia team growing every week. Hopefully we peak at the right time. Diedrich, I completely agree with you. And I'll be very honest, and I don't think I hit this very well the first couple of weeks. I had very little energy about the UT Martin game or the Ball State game. That's just not my cup of tea, right? And I was excited about the return of the season, and I was excited just to be in Sanford Stadium and kind of be around Georgia fans. I was excited about that part of it, but I can only get so excited about Georgia versus UT Martin or Georgia versus Ball State. Now, by appearances, it seems like this week's game is very much in keeping with those two. And perhaps this is just the mood that I'm in. I guess there's a chance that's true. But I'm going to tell you right now, I am way more excited about Georgia UAB than I was any of the first two games against so-called lesser competition then. And I think some of this stems from what somebody mentioned a moment ago. I think it was Philip Thomas who mentioned the energy of that halftime moment that we all saw from the SEC network, the possibility that Georgia might build from that. Now, if you want to be like a naysayer or kind of skeptical or whatever, you could say, well, I don't care what you're doing at UAB. That doesn't really matter. That's a bad football team. Perhaps that's the case. But I do think any kind of breakout moment for this offense here right now, we're going to discuss this a little bit deeper in a second, but I think any kind of breakout moment for this offense right now perhaps is exactly what this team needs as it gets ready to go on the road to Auburn next Saturday. That's a really big deal. So I am very excited about Georgia UAB. We heard yesterday from Trent Dilfer saying the atmosphere was going to be better than the Super Bowl that he once played in. We understand what he means when he says that, but in a roundabout way, I'm making a overly hyperbolic statement for a point here. This kind of is my Super Bowl on Saturday. Like, we saw remnants of some good. We saw some things that really need to be worked on last week for Georgia. Final tune-up here on Saturday before it gets real after that. I'm very curious to see what Georgia does. I'm really, really energized by this Georgia UAB game on Saturday. So we'll have plenty of time the next 2 days to talk about that. For now, it is almost 10 a.m. So let me hush up. We'll bring on the rest of our video audience, and we will get ready to get today's show started. Good morning, Dog Nation. I am Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Meriwether Tharp. We are happy to have you with us, no matter how you might be getting to us today, all across these video platforms. Just really looking forward to a really, really fun show on tap. It's Terrence Edwards stopping by. That's good news. Before the show is done, the biggest game of the weekend, believe it or not, both sides are actually talking about Georgia right now, which gives you an idea of how large a shadow Georgia casts over the sport. We'll address briefly one of the biggest concerns for Georgia moving into its final tune-up game on Saturday against UAB before its conference play the rest of the way for the Dogs as you head towards the stretch run of the season. There was a viral moment involving Carson Beck this week that I think has kind of changed the scenario potentially for Georgia here this season. We'll talk about that here coming up in just a few minutes. But also, off the top of the show, Saturday, whether you know it or not, is actually a somewhat historic day between the hedges at Sanford Stadium. It's history involving Georgia coach Kirby Smart. This is a really cool thing, even if Smart himself doesn't want to talk about it at all, so we'll do it for him. History on the verge of being made here for Georgia, remarkable to consider and fun to discuss here as we get things going on a Thursday. So we are glad to have you with us. It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Meriwether Tharp, and it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Meriwether Tharp, your source for Georgia divorce. Find them online at theatlantadivorceteam.com.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
I don't get to watch a lot of television, but I try to watch a little bit, sometimes kind of relax and sort of slow my brain down for a minute or two. Many of you are probably the same way. Now, what I typically do is I kind of have one show that I sort of stick with and like the one show that I sort of watch and kind of watch it through completion. You know, we call it binge watch, whatever else. I don't ever get to quite watch enough episodes of a show at a time to kind of consider it a binge watch. I'm more of like a little fragment watch, a little bit here and there along the way. I recently finished up the series Succession on HBO. Do you know what that is? About a very rich family. And there's a scene in the most recent season where the daughter gives her very, very rich elderly father a book, and the book has pictures of all the houses they've owned over the course of years. Very rich family, of course, owned a bunch of houses. And the dad basically doesn't even realize these are pictures of homes they've owned. And so the daughter, in kind of a snarky way, says, "Wow, Dad, you really don't like talking about the past, do you?" And I was thinking about that for some reason this week as it relates to Kirby Smart, because I think you can look at Kirby sometimes in his sort of public persona, the way that he projects himself publicly, and I think you'd be left to conclude, wow, when it comes to publicly, when it comes to the media, and maybe even addressing the fans through the media, there are moments in which Kirby Smart really does not like talking about the past. And obviously we have an opportunity this Saturday to look back on the recent past for Kirby Smart, because you may not be aware of this, perhaps many of you are. Saturday is the 100th game that Kirby Smart has coached for the Georgia Bulldogs. It's a remarkable thing. And yet this week, going back to yesterday, the SEC, every week all the media get on a teleconference, like a Zoom call type thing, and talk to the various coaches. And on that SEC teleconference this week, Kirby Smart was asked about coaching in his 100th game, and in keeping with a guy that does not really enjoy talking about the past very much, Smart wasn't all that interested in talking about this either. Let me show you the quote from Smart, essentially downplaying the whole idea. He says, it's a marker of some sort, the first 100. I don't know the significance of it outside of that. I wasn't aware of that. It's one of those things that if you do a good job and you recruit good players and have good organization and good support that allows you to make it to that number, and certainly want to go out and play our best game at that mark. So basically he said, all I'm worried about is playing a good game against UAB, essentially downplaying the entire idea of a 100th game and being customarily kind of modest about this, citing having good players and good organization around him, things like that. That's kind of what Kirby Smart does. But in terms of reflecting on, gosh, imagine where we were way back in 2016 when this all got started, Smart just does not like doing those kinds of things. But whether Smart wants to or not, the 100th game for him is worth discussing. And frankly, to give you a quick aside here for a moment, this, I think, at times can kind of be the role of the sports media. Sometimes people wonder, why do we have so much sports media? And what job do they actually do? Well, I don't know in some cases exactly what we all do necessarily. But one of the things that I do know that sports media can do well is chronicle the history that we see playing out in front of us. Because oftentimes those who are making history, they don't like stopping in the midst of making it to reflect on the history that they're making, and perhaps taking time to think about that might make them too self-aware. It might slow them down, and all of a sudden they're not quite on the same historic trajectory they were on. There's at least a possibility that's true. So, guys like me, loudmouths who shout into a microphone, sometimes taking a moment to say, hey, what we're watching play out is truly historic. Sometimes that's probably what the job requires here. And it's not just me doing that this week. SEC Network did this as well. They put out a graphic on their SEC Now, or whatever the show's called, their show this week, that I think you got to see to believe. This is truly amazing. So Kirby Smart, through 99 games at Georgia thus far, is 84-15 as a coach. Now you compare that to the first 100 games coaching the SEC for Bear Bryant at Alabama. He was 81-12-7. We had ties back then. Nick Saban at Alabama, 84-16. Steve Spurrier at Florida, 83-16-1. Philip Fulmer at Tennessee, 83-17 in his first 100 games as Tennessee coach. Now, what's amazing about this is Smart, by winning on Saturday, which you obviously believe he's going to do, can have a better record through his first 100 at Georgia than Nick Saban had at his first 100 at Alabama, and better records than Bear Bryant, Steve Spurrier, and Philip Fulmer. That's amazing in its own right. But what makes it even more amazing is that Smart was a rookie head coach when he first took this job. Right now, Nick Saban has the high water mark in terms of his first 100 games as a coach in the SEC. But by the time that Nick Saban became a coach in the SEC, he had been a head coach for far longer than that, right? His experience at Alabama, before that, head coach of the Miami Dolphins, had a stint at LSU. Before that, Michigan State. He was head coach prior to that there as well. Nick Saban was a veteran head coach when he arrived at Alabama. Kirby Smart was a brand new, fresh rookie, and he's had the success that he's had as quickly as he's had it. It is possibly true that Kirby Smart is well on his way when you see him compared to the likes of Bear Bryant, Steve Spurrier, and Nick Saban. It is quite possible that Kirby Smart is well on his way to being, let's just say it out loud. There is a chance when it's all said and done, Kirby Smart's the greatest coach of all time. That is very much within his grasp, very much within his reach. That is very much the kind of career he could be putting together. The first 100 games of his coaching career certainly tell that story. Now, on the TV show where that graphic was shown here this week, one of the analysts on the program, Takeo Spikes, the former Auburn Tiger, and by the way, a former high school teammate of Terrence Edwards, who will join us here a little bit later on, Takeo Spikes talked about what he thinks it is that makes Kirby Smart so great. This is what Takeo Spikes said.
Ultimately, for me, it's the ability to not rest on your laurels and just inflict pain and will consistently throughout the day, and that comes back with the win.
We've seen that, right? That's what Kirby Smart is about. It's the tenacity to keep competing, keep fighting, and keep pushing, and not stopping to say, hey, look what we did. It's always about, hey, look, here's what needs to be done next. The phrase that Smart made famous, WIN, what's important now? Well, it seems like what's important now to Smart is never the past. That's not what he enjoys talking about. But Here's my hope. Even if he doesn't want to speak about this in SEC teleconferences and doesn't want to speak about this directly to the fans, even if he wants to be more forward-looking, privately, I hope he does take a moment to appreciate just how amazing these last few years have been for him. And I hope he appreciates the fact that, gosh, this is not guaranteed for anybody, that he is living a remarkable life right now. I hope he takes time to appreciate that. And whether he does or not, I hope we all do there as well. Those of us who are Georgia fans, we've been given an incredible gift of some incredibly fun, entertaining football. It's really exciting to think that the best could still be yet to come. But for us who are kind of maybe more able to look back on the recent past here, the story tells itself. The Bear Bryants, the Kirby Smarts, the Nick Sabans, the Steve Spurriers, they are all mentioned in the same sentence here right now. And yet Smart, far younger than those guys were, far less experienced when he first got started here at Georgia, and perhaps on a trajectory that leads him to a level of accomplishment that far surpasses any of those guys there as well. All right, let me shift gears to something else here just for a moment. Yesterday on our program, we talked about the really cool, speaking of the SEC Network, the really cool video that the SEC Network put out of the halftime moment for Georgia against South Carolina. And it's amazing to me just how much chatter this has generated among Georgia fans. We knew it was good, we knew it was cool, but it seems to have kind of a viral quality that's even, I think, deeper than that. And I kind of want to explain what I think the ultimate result of this video might be. But as a way of getting there, let me kind of build to it this way, if you don't mind. Yesterday, on a completely different note, if you care about the NFL and if you follow the NFL, the most important story in the NFL yesterday were some very intriguing comments by Chicago Bears quarterback Justin Fields. Now, for the moment here, I don't want Fields' mention on this show to be like a relitigation of his time here at Georgia or what happened after that. That's not really what I'm interested in right now. I'm sort of only interested in Justin Fields as an NFL starting quarterback. And Fields' explanation yesterday that he wasn't happy with his current level of play for a very specific reason. Fields talked about this. Everyone around the NFL is talking about what Fields had to say. Let me let you hear it, and then I want to make a point about Georgia off what Justin says.
I felt like, I wasn't necessarily playing my game. I felt like I was kind of robotic and not just playing like myself. My goal this week is just to go out there and play football how I know how to play football. That includes thinking less and just going out there and playing off of instincts rather than just so much, so to say, info in my head, data in my head, and literally just going out there playing football. Because that's when, I play my best is I'm just out there playing free and being myself.
Fields went on in that same clip to blame his coaches for being, as he says, too robotic. I have no idea if that's true or not, and I frankly don't care. But when it comes to the idea of an athlete being robotic, we all have kind of an idea of what that means. If you play golf, you don't want a super mechanical swing. If you do anything athletically, or if you ever give like a speech at like a Rotary Club or something like that, you don't want to be really stiff and robotic. We are not athletic the way that Justin Fields is, but we all have an understanding that there is something about being too stiff, too tight, too tense in life, not kind of living in the moment and being in the flow, being in the zone, as the sports phrase that it's existed for decades has kind of been. We kind of know what being too stiff and too robotic feels like, and no matter what we're endeavoring to do, being too robotic is just not a good way to succeed. Justin Fields says, I'm frustrated with my level of play right now because I feel like I'm being too robotic. And when I heard Justin Fields say that yesterday, it actually kind of reminded me of something that Jake Fromm said on our show yesterday morning about Georgia's current quarterback, Carson Beck, and the work that Georgia's currently doing right now, unrelated to the Fields thing. This is just the Fields thing reminded me of this. Unrelated to the Fields thing, the work that Georgia's doing to prevent Carson Beck from having the kind of robotic, stiff, mechanical feeling that Justin Fields says that he's suffering through right now. I thought Jake Fromm had some interesting insight into how Georgia is helping Carson Beck kind of go out there and be in the moment and just sort of live and play and be relaxed. I think this is good stuff from Jake Fromm. It's the kind of thing you only get from a guy who knows what it feels like to have been in this spot before. This is what Jake said on our show yesterday.
It's tough when you are the quarterback at the University of Georgia. All eyes are on you. Everybody's waiting on you to go and make a play and take this team to the quote-unquote promised land and win another national championship. That's the goal. That's the expectation. And that's now the standard that they've built there at Georgia. There's there's a lot of weight on your shoulders. But I think what you kind of see them trying to do through the offensive plan is try to take a little bit off his plate and just let him play kind of free and easy and to just let him go complete balls.
What Jake says there at the end of that clip, they're trying to help Carson Beck right now being free and easy and go out there and just complete balls. I think that's an important statement because of a couple of things. A, Kirby Smart has told us many times that Carson's natural demeanor off the field is very relaxed. He's very cool. He doesn't get too up, doesn't get too down. We've heard Kirby Smart say that plenty. Carson Beck himself has said that on the field a little bit this season, he's been kind of nervous. He mentioned that before his first start. He was good enough to be candid about that. So what we have here is a little bit of a conflict as it relates to Beck. A relaxed demeanor off the field, perhaps not as relaxed yet on the field as he is in other walks of life. And what Jake Fromm, who knows the quarterback position, says, it looks to him like Georgia's trying to play in such a way right now that allows Carson Beck to grow more relaxed and be more just kind of at ease as he plays the position. Not thinking too much, not being too robotic, not being too mechanical, just going out there and letting it rip. Which brings us back to the video that everybody was talking about this week from the SEC Network. Because of all the cool things about the video, all the guys who stood up and spoke, Kirby Smart's amazing speech, which is the kind of thing of like a Hollywood movie, especially the production effort on the part of the SEC Network, which was truly incredible. The moment, though, that everybody seems to really be talking about right now is about the halfway part of the shorter clip that the SEC Network shared from the larger show that's been airing on TV on the network, where in the midst of like Mike Bobo up there, like, we got to do this and we got to do that, Carson Beck very coolly turns to the camera and winks. Now, I try on this show very hard not to do anything that doesn't work as well on podcast as it works on video because we have such great respect for our podcast audience. But for now, podcast folks, I want to play this for our video people because I want to kind of accentuate the point that I'm making. Many of you have already seen this anyway. If not, obviously we've already put a link up this and we'll put a link there again. But I want you to watch the Carson Beck wink here because this wink is sort of like the wink heard round the world here right now. And you can go ahead and play that. This is sort of the wink heard round the world here right now. Very relaxed, very cool, gives you a little, you play it again if you don't mind. Very relaxed, very cool, gives you a little bit of a smirk there at the end. Pretty clearly in the midst of a very stressful situation, in the midst of a very, tense moment in which some Georgia fans were wondering, okay, well, how good is Georgia really here right now? Carson Beck was cool enough, relaxed enough to look over to that camera, SEC Network, give it a little bit of a wink to the camera, and just kind of rolling on. And it's amazing how Georgia fans have been kind of responding to this. And the confidence that Georgia fans have in Beck, I'm not kidding here, I'm being serious. It seems to really be growing right now on the basis of that reaction. And I think there's a chance this video ends up being one of those things that perhaps propels the entire program and fan base to rally more around Carson, which I think they're in the midst of doing anyway. And perhaps the Georgia offense actually sort of builds on this and moves forward with a much higher level of success on the basis of what they learned about themselves in overcoming adversity to beat South Carolina. To go back to Jake Fromm here for a moment, when he joined us yesterday, he also talked about some of that same kind of stuff there as well. That when you look at the totality of what's happened for Georgia on offense here this season, that it's actually a little closer to really breaking out than maybe many of us realize, and maybe that breakout moment is about to come. Here are some very hopeful and positive words from Jake on the current nature of this Georgia offense, once again from yesterday's show.
It looks like they're just so close. It's just one third down that holds them short, or one drop ball, or one just missed deep throw, and they're so close to really firing on all cylinders, but at the end of the day, they're still putting up points. I mean, so they're right there. I thought Carson played a lot better in the second half. I think they're close, but I think we would all love to see them come out to a little bit of a faster start.
Perhaps that faster start comes this Saturday against UAB. I know it may sound a little bit corny, and I'm not trying to be overly hyperbolic here, but I think something about that wink may have changed things. I think Georgia fans who have been on the fence about Carson, I think they see the potential of what he can be, the kind of cool, collected leader that all quarterbacks are supposed to be. And this Georgia team that seems on the verge of really rallying around him, maybe that fully happens there on Saturday. I'm fascinated by the game against UAB. I think it's going to be quite a show to see. It's the final tune-up for Georgia before things get real after that. And based on the video we all saw from the SEC Network this week, I think Georgia's about ready to relax, settle in, and play some very good football. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Meriwether and Tharp. We are happy to have you with us no matter how you get to us today. Live on video, 9:45, 1st and 15, DawgNation.com, DawgNation app. 10 a.m. after that, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Twitch, all kinds of radio, video platforms. Radio, Athens Sports Radio 96 The Ref, podcast, every podcast platform you can think of. We're on them all. We're just happy to have you as a part of the program, and so thankful to our friends at Meriwether and Tharp who make it all possible. Meriwether and Tharp, your source for Georgia divorce. And I know divorce is not a fun conversation. I do get that. It's not the kind of conversation you want to have, not the kind of fun thing that you want to consider, but sometimes life isn't fun. Sometimes life is just real. And confronting reality, whatever that means for you, is an important and necessary step. But you don't have to confront that alone. If you find divorce a obvious, unavoidable, unmissable next step for you, then the best thing you can do is have a strong advocate on your side as you go through that divorce process. When I say that, I'm talking about my friends at Meriwether and Tharp, your source for Georgia divorce. They've been through cases like this thousands of times, so that gives them expertise in the law that can be leveraged for your benefit. You want the best possible relationship with your children moving forward, the best, most secure situation for your finances moving forward. All of that are kind of the offshoots of the divorce conversation, and Meriwether and Tharp is able to talk about those things and more with you, including considering some things you might not have even thought to even think about, but Meriwether and Tharp kind of, that's what they think about all the time. So it's why you want to reach out and have a free initial consultation with one of those Meriwether and Tharp attorneys. The website, theatlantadivorceteam.com. That's theatlantadivorceteam.com. Meriwether and Tharp is your source for Georgia divorce. And if I had to guess, our friends at Meriwether and Tharp may also be with us here coming up in November for our DawgNation invasion on the Tennessee River, because Bob and Ashley and the whole gang, the Tharp family, they love being a part of stuff like this, and we wish everybody could be there, of course. Right now, we know that that's not possible because we are technically sold out when it comes to our DawgNation invasion. There is a wait list, though. You can go to DawgNation.com. You can get on that wait list, and if we can secure some more space, if we can kind of move some people around, figure out a way to add another deck to the boat or something like that, we'll get you all on board there. It's going to be an incredible time. So DawgNation.com, wait list to get on the wait list for our DawgNation invasion on the Tennessee River. Hope you get a chance to enjoy that. We're going to enjoy Terrence Edwards on our show coming up in just a minute there as well. Prior to that, though, I do want to go around the doghouse. It's presented today by our friends at ServPro, and I meant what I said a moment ago. I think the very fun wink from Carson Beck and the viral video from Georgia and the SEC network this week, I think there's some staying power to that. I think there is perhaps a little bit of confidence born out of the come-from-behind win against South Carolina and a chance for Georgia to rally around itself because it did not panic. Kirby Smart didn't peel paint off the walls. Georgia didn't wilt. Nobody got stiff. Nobody, to use Justin Fields' phrase, no one got too robotic and mechanical and kind of wilted under the pressure. Georgia handled that. They moved forward. And now they move on to what's next. And as Georgia does that, there are also some real serious concerns for this team to kind of deal with here too, because at some point in time, for Georgia to be the best team in the country, you need the Georgia offensive line to also play like the best group in the country there as well. There was a moment last year, about halfway through the season, where I looked at what I viewed as the three top national championship contenders, Alabama, Ohio State, Georgia, and I said, down the stretch, the rest of the way, this is about halfway through the month of October a year ago, down the stretch, the rest of the way, which of these offensive lines plays the best, that's likely to be the team that won the national championship. And I don't care what the Joe Moore Award said. It was the Georgia offensive line that played the best a year ago, and ultimately that offensive line performance propelled Georgia to the national championship. I believe there's a degree to which the same thing is kind of true here this year. The best offensive lines on paper, I don't know they've quite established themselves the way that we would have expected them to. Not only has Georgia had its offensive line struggles, some of that because of injury, the Alabama offensive line, which on paper was also thought to be one of the nation's best, they've actually been not very good thus far this year. Alabama fans will be more than happy to tell you about that. That's not just me saying that as a Bama troll. That's what Bama fans themselves would say. We knew the Ohio State offensive line was going to have some issues. We talked about that plenty during the offseason. Thus far, that's kind of been true too. So you once again have a situation where either teams that were thought to have great offensive lines or great national contenders that we would assume would have very good offensive lines. Some of these groups haven't quite asserted themselves as of yet, but the opportunity exists for someone to do it, and obviously on this show we both hope and believe it's going to be Georgia that eventually will. But you got to figure out what you're doing right now for the next few weeks while Amarius Mims is injured and on the road to recovery here. And Kirby Smart used kind of an interesting phrase here this week in terms of all the shifting around and moving around that Georgia's having to do to try to find its best five here right now. Kirby was pretty candid about the kind of all-hands-on-deck mentality that exists for this Georgia offensive line. This is what he said about that on Tuesday night.
Truss has worked guard and tackle just like he always has. More tackle this week. Blasky has practiced, and he is a tough dude. But he's hurting. He's trying his best out there, and O-line is it's a position that you might get away with a little bit of an MCL because you're not out there on space running and cutting. But he's not 100% healthy. So he's out there working. Monroe's working at tackle. Bo's been developing, playing some at tackle. Dylan can go out and play tackle. Micah can go out and play tackle. Chad Lindbergh plays tackle. So we got musical chairs. We're just trying to get it where if the next guy goes down, we can get the best guy in.
I would think you would say right now we don't exactly know who Georgia's going to start on Saturday. Is it going to be Blasky in there, able to go at tackle? Do you possibly consider playing him at guard? Truss, who I think got pretty good reviews at the tackle spot last week, does he stay there this week? I think it's probably still too early to know. But the one thing you do hear from Kirby there is a lot of names being mentioned. Georgia now really forced to consider its second offensive line right now as it also thinks about its best top five there as well. Now, the other day, Carson Beck told us that he believes that Georgia has two offensive lines, a number two group, in other words, that's capable of being a starter-level performer and capable of providing Georgia exactly what it needs. That's how much confidence he also has in Georgia's offensive line depth here right now. And the guys who've been a part of that depth, you better believe they believe in themselves there too, because one of the guys who seemingly has kind of come from those number two backup ranks to potentially now being a starter-level player for Georgia and also just a flat-out starter at playing a lot during the game is Dylan Fairchild, one of the names that Kirby Smart mentions, perhaps at a couple of different positions. But Dylan may be sort of speaking on behalf of all of those kind of what we think of as backup offensive linemen at Georgia, saying we're all waiting to show how good we think we can be and how much we're capable of contributing to this Georgia offensive line right now. This is what Dylan Fairchild said about that here this week.
Very. We got plenty of guys that could play. We got so many guys that are deserving to play, and we got a deep O-line.
Let me give you a bottom line on this discussion. A great player can win you a game. That's why we hype up so many teams at the beginning of the season, and that's why eventually most of the time that hype subsides. It's because on a brief basis, a short 1 or 2 game stretch, a great player can win you a game, and everybody's talking about that great player. But over the course of a long season, it takes a roster to win a championship, and that's why most of the early season hype, typically for most teams, doesn't really last, because most rosters can't stand up to the stress test that comes along the way as guys get injured and things happen, and all of a sudden now you're digging deep into the ranks of your backups to find guys to start at positions all across the board. Georgia has won the last 2 national championships because of the strength of its roster. And what we're going to find out here over the course of the next few weeks is, once again, just how strong that roster is. It doesn't take very long, in this case less than a month, to all of a sudden be considering offensive linemen beyond just the first 5. Guys that you thought were backups, guys who've been here for a couple of years, haven't played a ton as of yet. All of a sudden, those players are in a much larger microscope now, magnified much to a greater degree because they're being called into larger duty. Now, in years past, the last 2 years in particular, this is when Georgia has showed itself how good it really is. And moving forward the rest of the way, demonstrating how good of an offensive line Georgia can be when it's having to dig deep to kind of move guys around and do some shuffling to find its best 5, that's the opportunity that exists for Georgia here once again. And that is Around the Doghouse, presented today by our friends at Serve Pro. And, of course, Georgia going through a little bit of an issue, what feels like on the football field anyway, a little bit of a crisis when it comes to its offensive line. But in your own life, there are far larger crises than that. You may be dealing with fire damage to your home or water intrusion perhaps to a piece of commercial property, a business that you own. Well, anytime you've got that kind of cleanup issue to deal with, the thing that you want is for it to all be put back together and put back together like it never even happened. That's what our friends at ServPro are all about. They are restoration specialists. That means they can restore your situation, your rental property, the home that you live in, the commercial property that you house your business in, whatever type of thing we're talking about here. Their restoration specialists can always put it all back together like it never even happened. That's what ServPro is all about. Each franchise also independently owned and operated there as well. That means you're doing business with someone who's got just as much of a vested interest in the outcome as you do yourself. So please find them online. It's servpro.com. That's SERV, servpro.com, to find out more about that today. All right. Before we're done on today's show, the biggest game of the weekend, the one involving Notre Dame and Ohio State, believe it or not, Georgia's actually been a topic for both those teams here this week, which I think gives you an idea of just how large a shadow the Dogs cast right now. Before we're done today, we'll talk more about that. But for now, on everything about where Georgia is and possibly where it could go from here in the next few weeks, a guy who certainly has plenty to say on that topic, it's the former Georgia wide receiver, Terrence Edwards, here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Meriwether Tharp.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
We will say hello to Terrence Edwards. And Terrence, obviously I know how outspoken you were over the weekend about what you currently think about this Georgia offense and what it's capable of doing from here. We clearly want to hear a lot from you about that today. But if you don't mind, prior to that, we were talking about the offensive line a moment ago and some of the issues that Georgia's facing along the offensive line really set up because of injury. Amarius Mims going to be out here for a few weeks, and Mims, who I think is kind of a first-round talent, gives you an idea of the substantial level of talent that Georgia has right now on its current injury list. Not only is it a long list of names, these are kind of bold print names for Georgia right now. How big of a concern are the injuries for you? Obviously, Georgia won't use this as an excuse, but this does sort of set itself up to be a little bit of a reason for pause if you're a UGA fan. Is the injury list getting too long for Georgia yet?
Well, it's always a concern when you have a lot of pencil-in starters that's on this list, but you got to go back to the way Kirby has recruited. He has brought depth to this team, so it's a concern, but also if you look at it, that these guys that are starting now is getting valuable minutes that will probably help down the line once you get really into the meat of the schedule. We could go into UAB this week and win with our backups, but once you get to the Tennessee, the Floridas, you're going to need all your top players, your pencil-in starters ready for those games.
You can't play football too carefully, of course, but there's a part of me that almost wonders, well, given how long the injury list is, given the fact that Georgia's on the road next week at Auburn, is this one of those days on Saturday where Georgia just wants to get in, get out, and try not to add any more names to this list? Because, there does come a point which, hey, you've got so many injuries that it really does negatively impact your overall level of play. I don't know if Georgia's to that point yet or not. I guess the next few weeks will tell us. But in terms of how Georgia plays on Saturday, do you believe they will either consider or possibly need to play more carefully because of just how substantial the injury list is at the moment?
I don't think you could go out and just play careful. I think you got to go out and play football. Football is a dangerous game. Injuries happen. You never know when the injury is going to occur. I mean, just look at Travis Hunter over this weekend. That was an unscripted injury where the guy took a hit at him and now he's out for 3 weeks. So how careful was he playing in that game? So we got a lot to work on. So we can't go into this game trying to be careful. One of the biggest concerns that I've had right now, I've been very boisterous on my social media, is the red zone offense. Like, we have to go into this game right now and execute in the red zone. Moving the football, if you just look at the stats and look down to it, we're 13, 14-play drives. We are moving the football. Our third down conversion has been pretty good. So all this hate, Carson Beck hate, we are moving the football. We just haven't had the scoring rate touchdown-wise that I like. We missed 2 field goals this past weekend. We got to get 7. So whatever that is, whatever that in turn, we got to do a better job in the red zone operation. That's my biggest takeaway from last week's game.
All right, let's move into that because I think that's an important point to talk about. And let me use kind of a segue to Carson Beck as a way of doing that. I think for Beck thus far this season, he's certainly been more good than not. I think he's shown you some glimpses of why this Georgia coaching staff has had so much confidence in him. And yet I would also add to that he hasn't quite yet had the sort of breakout moment that allows everybody to rally around him. I kind of somewhat half-kiddingly, half-seriously said a moment ago, the wink in the SEC Network video this week may have been the kind of thing that sort of reminds you that he's got the potential swagger to be the kind of quarterback that can lead. There's a little bit of a Stetson Bennett-ish vibe to that to me in terms of, Stetson, who had, sometimes a lot of swagger as the Georgia quarterback the last, couple of years. How do you see things progressing for Carson right now? And do you think there's a chance against UAB, which ironically was a team that Stetson Bennett put up huge numbers against a couple of years ago? Do you think this final tune-up game for Georgia before it goes on the road in the SEC, do you think this could be the game in which Carson really breaks out in a huge way and settles all doubt and discussion about him being the guy to lead Georgia where it wants to go?
Well, I believe, in my opinion, I have to push back a little bit. I think his breakout moment was the second half of the South Carolina game. I think if you look at his stats, I think it was 12 for 17, about 150 yards in the rain. He would have led his team on 6 straight scoring possessions or something like that. Don't quote me on my stats. So I think he did exactly what I would like for him to do for 4 quarters in the second half versus an SEC opponent. Down 11 points. You got a quarterback that's starting his first SEC game in that type of environment, and he went and performed in that second half like I think I've seen and all the coaches have seen him do. So I think that was a pivotal moment for him and his confidence going into UAB next week, then against the Auburn game. And I think Auburn is on the road, and it's one of the hardest places to play down in Auburn. So I think the second half was a confidence booster for him, a confidence booster for this team. And that's the team that we have been looking for offensively and defensively. So the type of performance, only for a half, that I could see catapulting Carson to where we all think he could do it. If we could do that for 4 quarters, then that's the quarterback that we all would love and like to see.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, and I'm happy to hear you share your perspective on that, Terrence. And I guess to add to that a little bit, that if and I think a lot of people probably agree with you, that if you're right, that the actual breakout for Carson came last week in the second half against South Carolina, how important then do you think it is to now build off that and now start the game against UAB, something that Georgia really hasn't done as well the last 3 games, at least in terms of scoring points? How important it is to kind of take the momentum from last week's second half into the first week into the first half against UAB and kind of finally get off to the fast start that every Georgia fan wants to see the Dogs have?
Oh, it's very important. I think we have to start off fast next week. And I think a lot of the people say fast starts, but if we get that first possession, we go 3 and out. If you just look at the game last week, I think we only got 1 possession in the first quarter. With the new time change and the 2-time rules, you're very limited on possession. So you have to go out and score some type of points. You have to go out and move the ball and control the clock and try to limit their possession. So that this team go out offensively, that we move the football, and once we get into the red zone, we have to score 7. We can't rely on a freshman kicker right now who missed 2 field goals under 40 yards to score points. We have to get a confidence. If we put a 13, 14-play drive, we have to score 7 points.
So I think almost every Georgia fan is going to agree with you on that, being more aggressive down there in the scoring area, taking those chances that result in touchdowns, because you can't count on field goals right now, and plus settling for field goals not really a recipe for success anyway. I think almost every Georgia fan would agree with you on that. How about the other part of this? And I've been specifically asked to ask you about this. We also talked to Jake Fromm about this yesterday. The kind of big shot plays, explosive plays that make a trip to the red zone unnecessary, right? The kind of, deep shots downfield that sometimes allow you to score before you even get inside the 20. Why do you think there haven't been more of that for Georgia here thus far this year?
That's one thing I've been big on social media, that, we don't know the the play call. We don't know the progression reads. We don't know where he's been told to look. So we've been a real ball-control offense right now, haven't had that many explosive plays. But last week, Ra Thomas did have an explosive play in that second half that kind of helped us get into the scoring opportunity. But I don't know. I don't know why we taking shots. He has a big enough arm to push the football downfield. So I would love to see us take those shots. I think we have the speed on the outside with C.J. Smith, who's coming on, with Arian Smith, who's coming on. And Ra Thomas is definitely has been a player that I've been impressed with the last 2 weeks of being able to make downfield catches. So we have to ways to get explosive plays, but also find ways to limit mistakes. And that's what we've done so far. What I've been impressed with is the mistakes that he hasn't made. I think the one turnover that he does have is, I think, the receiver fault. It was tipped off his hands, but he's been very careful with the football. That's coming from the top, honestly. I don't know that for a fact, but I believe that's coming from the top. But as he continues to grow, we all got to – this is his third start in 4 years. So I think as the season goes along, as Kirby get real comfortable with pushing the ball downfield, I think we will.
Shifting gears here, off the top of the show, I talked about the fact that Saturday is Kirby Smart's 100th game as Georgia's head coach, and it's remarkable to think, how quickly this 100 games is going to pass. It seems like just yesterday we were doing 93K Day, G Day 2016. Now all of a sudden Kirby Smart's actually a pretty veteran coach, and the other part of this is that through 100 games, you can very easily say perhaps no one's been more successful through his first 100 games as a head coach, and perhaps no one's had a more successful start in an SEC coaching career than what Kirby Smart has had. I kind of joked about the fact that Kirby doesn't seem to like talking about that kind of stuff very much, but I do believe it's appropriate to consider just how amazing this is. For Georgia fans, we ought to be appreciative of it. It's been an incredible run and so entertaining and really just kind of a wonderful experience. But also for those of us who like sports, the history of sports, we are seeing a historic career playing out in front of us, and it could result, when it's all said and done, in Smart very rightly being mentioned, certainly alongside any coach that's ever coached, if not ahead of any coach that's ever coached. You can't really overstate just how successful the start of Kirby Smart's career has been, can you?
I'm going to say this right here, right now, and everyone can hear me. We all love Vince Dooley. He's the pioneer. He is just unbelievable as a person. I got to know him very well since he was the AD, the whole Dooley family. Everyone knows how I feel about Coach Rick. Knows that. But if Kirby stopped coaching today, he is the best coach in Georgia history. He is the best coach in Georgia history, and I'm going to say that with my chest out. I believe that, what he's done to this program, he has really put us back in the national, being one of the elite programs year in and year out. And it's just remarkable what he's done at his school, at his alma mater. And that is, I think, it's even more special that he's doing it at the school that he grew up loving, grew up playing for, and now he's the head coach at the school, and he's been able to achieve what he's achieved in a short period of time. Right now, I believe the greatest coach in Georgia history.
No, I think that's a very fair statement. When you look at just the level of success that he's enjoyed in the time that he has been here, I think that's a very fair statement. And the flip side of that is, I was doing a little bit of the math while you're talking. So I think if Kirby were sitting here, and if we could really convince him to have this conversation, which would have to really twist his arm to do, but if we could really convince him to have this conversation, I think the thing that he would probably acknowledge about Coach Dooley's legacy is that even though Smart's got, 2 SEC championships, another 4 to get to Dooley's 6 is still a pretty big accomplishment. Now, do I believe that Kirby will get there? Yeah, I do. But getting to 6 SECs is a pretty big accomplishment. And this will be his 85th win on Saturday, assuming that it comes. Dooley had 201 in his career. So if I'm doing the back of the napkin math on this correct, that's basically almost 12 wins a season for the next 10 years to get to the Dooley mark of 201, which I also believe that Kirby will get there. the stretch of success through 100 games would lead you to believe that anything is possible. And yet it's a little bit like the Tiger Woods Jack Nicklaus thing of the better Tiger did, the more you realized how substantial the Nicklaus accomplishments were. I think there is some of this that's also in play here, too, that as Kirby Smart kind of knocks off these milestones year after year after year, you'll start to realize, wow, the longevity of Coach Dooley's success really is pretty cool and pretty amazing, because 201 wins, 6 SEC championships, that's still really hard to do, even if Kirby Smart is on his way to potentially being the best of all time.
Oh, most definitely. Like I said, we all admire Coach Dooley. He is Georgia football. That's why his name is on the field, Dooley Field. And what he's done and what he did for our program on and off the field is something that none of us would sneeze about. We are grateful for the great man, Vince Dooley. Grateful for it. But I just believe Kirby right now, especially if he stays on the trajectory that he's on, I still believe today that if he stops, I still would put him number one. Because of, the time is different. A lot of things is different that he has to deal with than other coaches didn't have to deal with. So you have to add to an account of those. And I just remember one thing he told me that sticks with me, and this is Kirby Smart says, with the way we are now in the transfer portal, and especially transfer portal, you have to re-recruit your own players at the end of the season, try to convince them to stay because someone is in their ear telling them they should leave, they should do all this. So you got to go re-recruit these players over to convince them to stay. And I think had to deal with the things that he's dealing. I know times has changed, and Coach Dooley had things that he had to deal with. Coach Trick had things, but recruiting your own players, knowing that they can just up and transfer after 6 months is crazy to me. But he's dealing with a different time, and he's dealing with it very well. And that's why I put him at the top right now.
No, I think that's a really strong take, Terrence. I really like that. On a much less happy note to close things out, we all saw Monday night the horrific injury that Nick Chubb suffered, and we've seen the outpouring of support both from inside DawgNation on that, but also the football world at large. As a player yourself, what does Nick Chubb mean to you, a guy who clearly plays the game the right way, has been through a horrific injury recovery before, came out on the other side, I believe, just as good, if not better than he was before. Now being asked to do that again, it seems incredibly unfair. It was obviously a kind of a grotesque scene in terms of the injury that he suffered on Monday Night Football, but we all wish Nick the best in his recovery. From your perspective in particular, though, as a former player, what does it mean when you watch Nick getting ready to kind of go on this journey again of having to come back from a very tough injury?
We've seen this movie before. We've seen that this young man has the perseverance to go out and just do the things that a lot of people, including myself, wouldn't have the mental toughness to do. Coming back from the first knee injury and still being the Nick Chubb that we all know, having watched my brother go to something a little different, and I know how hard he worked to get back, and it was never the same. And Nick coming back and being the Nick Chubb that we all love, I'm saddened for him. But if anybody can get through this situation, it's Nick Chubb. So I'm happy if it had to happen to anyone, it happened to him, because we all know how hard that young man worked, and he will come back and ask him to be even better. So I pray for the young man. I don't know if my brother reached out to him yet. Again, I know they talked a lot with the first injury. I just know, just from what Robert went through, I know how hard it is. Hard Nick works and where his heart is, that he will overcome this again.
Has your brother ever said, obviously, and people I think know his story, but if for younger folks who don't, this is a first-round pick, New England Patriots. He's at the Pro Bowl, has a really freak injury, and kind of like a flag football game in the sand, right? Terrence, it's just the strangest thing in the world that led to this really kind of career-altering injury for him. Has he ever said modern technology, medical science being where it is now, would that same injury have been as devastating for him if it happened in 2023 as if it was back in 1998, I guess it would have been? Has he ever talked much about in terms of how the medical science has changed the particular injury that he dealt with?
No, he never spoke about the modern day medicine and all the things that we have now that we didn't have back then. The main thing that Robert had to deal with was his artery, and that was the MCLP said all that we could come back for, but once he didn't have full control of his nervous system, that was the biggest thing, to trying to get his nerves and his artery to start firing up again. And that was the biggest obstacle that he had to face. And I don't know what modern medicine now that they have can get those nerves firing back again like normal. But I just sit and just think about it, BA, like, just what if he didn't have this injury, what his career would look like. And I think, and he's a man of God. He don't question why. I think God put him in a spot to go and coach football and impact young men. And I don't know if he would have been a high school coach impacting young men if we'd have had that 10 to 12-year career. I don't know what his life would have been like, but this is what he was called to do, and he's not going to question what God has put in front of him because he's impacting young men's life. Win or lose, doesn't matter. He's helping young men become better people in this society.
Terrence, that's a great perspective. I really appreciate you sharing that. We love having you on the show here each and every week. And for people who want, more of you on social media, had some great thoughts on the game last Saturday, but you're also talking about the wide receivers that you're working with as a part of the Terrence Edwards Wide Receiver Academy. If people want to connect with you, how can they do so?
Yes, you can find me on all social media platforms at Terrence Edwards Wide Receiver Academy.
Terrence, appreciate your time. We'll look forward to talking to you again next week.
Thank you.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Yeah, I think that Terrence is right. I do believe that Kirby Smart's the best coach in Georgia football history. I believe that's true today. And I think the point that I would make to kind of like mitigate against that a little bit is that if you only judge Coach Dooley on the basis of one national championship, in other words, if you make it, well, Kirby's got 2 national championships and Vince Dooley's got 1, therefore Kirby's the better coach. I think Kirby is the best coach in Georgia history, but I do believe that's the wrong way to look at Vince Dooley. There was a period of time in this sport, and this is kind of hard for many of us to understand because we perhaps weren't old enough to fully appreciate it, but there was a period of time in this sport in which the national championship wasn't really that much of a thing in college football. Kind of pre-BCS, certainly pre-college football playoff, this sport was fairly content not to have much of a structure around deciding who won its national championships. Everybody in college football was seemingly kind of content with that. And so you've got these situations where, an SID many years later goes back and pencil whips the rest of the country and kind of gives Alabama a handful of like paper national championships. Does that make Bear Bryant a better coach? I don't know that it does. Bear Bryant's already a great coach, even as a kind of an Alabama hater. I'm not going to dispute Bear Bryant's status as a truly all-time great coach. I'm just saying that the national championships as kind of the end-all, be-all for the argument of guys who coach in a very different era of college football, I think that's a little bit of a mistake. And as Smart compiles more and more success in his future, and we obviously believe he's kind of only just getting started, I think one of the things that will be good about that is it will cause us to consider just how significant the Dooley resume is, even apart from the one national championship. Getting the national title, obviously, to most of us, is the kind of punctuation mark that validates a career. Rightly or wrongly, that's just kind of how sports fans treat coaches, players, things like that. Hey, did you win a ring? Do you have a championship? Guys who don't, a la Charles Barkley, are kind of always remembered that way. Guys who do, guys who win several of them, they kind of get put into a different category. That's just kind of the way that it goes. So Dooley kind of has the validation of having won a national championship, but the real story of who he is as a coach is 6 SEC championships and 201 career wins. Kirby Smart's going to be at 85 if he wins on Saturday, but as I said before, to get to 201, if I did the math correctly, and there's always a chance that I didn't, that's like 12 wins a season for the next 10 years to get to that 201 mark. And it's easy to say, oh, yeah, just pencil him in. Kirby wins 12 games every year. But doing that for another 10 years, that's a whole nother decade. If it was that easy, more people would be doing it than just Kirby Smart. And, by the way, even just coaching for a long time. gets to be kind of a hard thing. Vince Dooley was the head coach at Georgia for 25 years. I hope Kirby Smart's the coach of Georgia for at least that long. He's certainly young enough that he could be. But life is also kind of a weird thing sometimes where, I don't know. If you gave me, all the freedom in the world to sort of pontificate, hypothesize about how the Smart era eventually comes to an end, obviously of his own choosing, how he chooses for it to end and when that's going to occur, I'm honestly not sure. Obviously, I hope it goes on for decades and decades and decades, and I guess in a roundabout way, I sort of believe that it will. But as he accomplishes more and more things, I think we'll come to realize just how hard it is to get 201 career wins and just how significant 6 career SEC championships are. So, bottom line here, Terrence Edwards is right. Kirby Smart's the best coach in the history of Georgia football. 85 games, I think, is enough for him to prove that. But the resume of Vince Dooley is one that should not be shortchanged, not by a long shot. So, with that said, we'll get ready to go cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. I'll quickly remind you, big things going on with Royal Caribbean, perhaps in 2024, none bigger than the DawgNation Cruise, because it's bigger and better than it's ever been before. RoyalDogs.com, the website to go to find out about the information about Allure of the Seas, the great Oasis-class ship that we're going to be on, leaving out of Port Canaveral, going to Nassau in the Bahamas. Perfect day, Coco Cay. You got to understand, any Royal Caribbean cruise vacation I take, I'm going to want Perfect Day Coco Cay to be a part of that, because Perfect Day Coco Cay is exclusive for those on a Royal Caribbean cruise vacation. And there's so many fun new things happening at Perfect Day Coco Cay. Some great, really cool add-ons that make that island so much more fun to enjoy. You should check that out from our friends at Royal Caribbean just on your own. But please know that we're going to have a great time on board Allure of the Seas for our DawgNation cruise. So go to RoyalDogs.com and please be a part of it this upcoming April. All right, let's take a couple of looks here at some of the things happening around the SEC. So here's what I'm going to do. Tomorrow, we're going to give you final thoughts on really the biggest Saturday, perhaps, of the entire season here. When I was a kid, like younger, like teenager, college, remember when ESPN, I don't think they do this kind of stuff anymore. Too busy talking about the NBA, I guess. But ESPN used to like have these like graphics and like these themes. Showdown Saturday. Do you remember Showdown Saturday? They'd have like the idea that the weekend has a theme. I don't know that ESPN still does this, but this is a really cool kind of Showdown Saturday type weekend. Now, Georgia's not a part of this at all. The Georgia's playing UAB, of course. But, Ohio State, Notre Dame, Alabama, Ole Miss, Clemson, Florida State. These are great, fun games. And so tomorrow, we'll give you our final thoughts on all of these big games as we kind of roll into the weekend. But for today, as a setup for that, I want to give you the undercard here for a moment, because I think the sort of mid-card, undercard for Saturday is also really good too. I want to focus in on a couple of SEC teams that I think are in something close to like sort of must-win territory. Now, this is kind of a different level of must-win, but I think it's must-win territory in a roundabout way for both these programs, starting with Texas A&M. Now, spoiler alert here, I think A&M could be in some real trouble against Auburn. I think Hugh Freeze is a better coach than Jimbo Fisher is. I think that while Auburn's clearly got its issues, its close win at Cal demonstrates this is far from a perfect team. I think that Texas A&M is a little bit of a mess, and the impact that Bobby Petrino was supposed to have as offensive coordinator, I don't know that we're seeing that as of yet. They are a favorite against Auburn on Saturday, but I think that Auburn's going to come in there and give Texas A&M everything that it wants, be very competitive in this game, at least closer than the experts think, if not on their way to a possible outright win. And if Jimbo Fisher loses this, at that point in time, on the heels of a Miami loss a couple of Saturdays ago, the Fisher era is essentially over. We could see a lot of coaching turnover in the SEC this offseason. I believe that's a possibility. The Jimbo Fisher buyout is huge, but the financial penalty of watching Texas enter the SEC next year with more momentum on the field than you have, that's a potentially even worse financial penalty than the huge buyout that you'd have to pay to Jimbo Fisher. Texas A&M simply can't afford to have that happen. They've got to have some excitement on the field, some energy around their program, and Jimbo Fisher right now is providing none of that. And clearly this is one of those things that I got way wrong. I thought A&M was justified in spending big to bring in a national championship winning coach. I thought they would eventually see some dividends because of that investment. But honestly, I don't know there's anything in college football in the last, let's just say the 21st century. I don't know that there's anything in college football in the 21st century that feels more like a fluke than Jimbo leading Florida State to a 2013 national title right now. I didn't know this at the time, but it seems obvious here in the moment that he has had almost no ability to kind of replicate that success ever again. He didn't make the playoff the following year at Florida State, but a year after that, they kind of completely fallen apart, and moving that to A&M has not worked at all. And so if he loses on Saturday, you can essentially go ahead and start thinking about a coaching search for Texas A&M, I believe. And I do think that Texas A&M could be in some trouble against Auburn. Another SEC team that I think is in a little bit of a must-win situation, although not to the same degree that Texas A&M is, and no threat to his coaching tenure. I think that Shane Beamer's doing a really good job at South Carolina. I thought he had the Gamecocks really ready to play against Georgia on Saturday. Shane Beamer deserves some credit for that. But this is the hard thing about the SEC. And it's a cliche, but things become a cliche because of how true they are. That sometimes you can show improvement that's not really reflected in your one-loss record. And I do believe that South Carolina is a program on the rise, but the challenge for Beamer in terms of keeping people happy, because SEC fans just, they have high expectations. The challenge that Beamer has is putting together a one-loss record that reflects the overall positive momentum of the program. I believe it exists. I believe it's real for South Carolina. But I also believe that just given the nature of how hard it is to win the SEC, that it's kind of tough sometimes to have a win-loss record that reflects what's perhaps happening internally for your program. And that's why Saturday's game against Mississippi State, I think, for South Carolina is really important. Gamecocks are favored. We expect them to win. But we also sometimes see that teams the week after playing a very physical football team oftentimes don't play their best. That could be true for South Carolina the week after playing a team like Georgia. Plus, when you have a halftime lead, when you think perhaps you could be on your way to winning the game, when that doesn't quite work out, can you find the same level of emotion the following Saturday there as well? That seems like a real question, too. Gamecocks are at home. They're taking on Mississippi State. I've told you before, I believe that Zach Arnett is very likely one and done. I believe that Mississippi State was in a tough situation. They made the best of that moment. They promoted Arnett. Arnett's trying to permeate the rest of the program with the tough-minded defensive mentality that he has. But it's just simply too much of a change to try to undergo too quickly. It is destined, I think, to be a spectacular failure. And even though Arnett's been named as the permanent coach of Mississippi State, I believe they will have to move on from him at the end of the season. So understanding that as the backdrop, this is the kind of game in which South Carolina needs to be careful. I believe it will. I believe it'll win the game. But be careful if you're South Carolina on Saturday with Mississippi State coming in. Another SEC game, kind of on the undercard, that I do think is worth following here this weekend. It's LSU hosting Arkansas. Two things happening here. LSU's statement win against Arkansas, I should say against Mississippi State last week, was the kind of thing that established, I believe, some real momentum for the program. LSU last week showed you what it is capable of being. That the loss to Florida State is not one of these types of things that kind of votes LSU off the island here at the beginning of the season. No, not by a long shot. Florida State's a very good team. LSU lost the game. LSU has regrouped since then. They've been on quite a hot streak since then. The Mississippi State game last week, certainly an example of that. And now against Arkansas on Saturday, my expectation is that LSU kind of runs through them here once again. I think that Sam Pittman's in kind of a tough spot here right now. The loss to BYU last week was not a good one. You got to be very careful here in terms of not letting this get too sideways too fast, but I do believe that LSU is a really good team. So I think there's some intrigue here with what's going to go on with LSU and Arkansas. My expectation is that LSU continues to show that it is among the national elite and quite possibly the class of the SEC West, much the way that it was a year ago. And for Sam Pittman and Arkansas, they need what they can get. Good play where they can find it. Wins when they can, keeping losses close when possible. If you're Sam Pittman in Arkansas, you need to be very careful on Saturday. I'll also briefly mention this. And I mention this for the simple reason that the Georgia schedule, we're kind of left to wonder how the perception of it evolves over the course of time. One of the games that could be more interesting for Georgia when it's eventually played is the game against Missouri. Missouri, of course, won last week against reigning Big 12 champion Kansas State. Playing Memphis here this week, but it sounds like Brady Cook, the quarterback for Missouri, is questionable here in this particular game. If he doesn't play, Sam Horn, who, of course, we know from Collins Hill High School, throwing touchdowns to Travis Hunter, he will be the guy that steps in and plays in place of Cook. But, I mean, I think there are a lot of people who tell you that Missouri should be ranked in the top 25 right now. And Memphis, if they can win the backup quarterback on Saturday, then you're looking at the Tigers probably in the top 25, I'm guessing. And they've still got to play LSU before they play Georgia so they could fall back out again. But right now, of the games on the Georgia schedule that perhaps look a little bit more interesting and maybe just a little bit tougher than they would have appeared on paper before the season began, I would say the Missouri game is perhaps in that category here right now. And then I'll very quickly mention this. Michigan has had a very quiet start to the season. It's kind of interesting that, we think about Georgia kind of being off the radar, not much being said about, Georgia, and, Georgia hasn't quite yet had its showcase game, let the nation know just how good that it is. But the other team that got tons of hype during the offseason, and some of that we kind of mocked and made fun of, but the other team that got, tons of hype during the offseason, Michigan. When's the last time you heard anybody on the national level talk about Michigan at all yet this season? Obviously, we've kind of come out of the Jim Harbaugh suspension. They're getting ready to play their first Big Ten game against Rutgers on Saturday. Rutgers is, not a terrible team right now, but obviously not a very good team either. But the point is, it's much like Georgia's kind of waiting to kind of reintroduce itself to the country with a big game here at some point in time. Michigan's kind of the same way, and so we'll see what Big Ten play provides the Wolverines in that regard, as Michigan, after a very, very weak non-conference slate to begin the year, starts to step up a little bit here into some more I won't say even competition because that's not what Rutgers is, but at least a little higher level of play here moving forward will make that cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. Also, before we move on here, I want to get back to Georgia in a moment. Let me give a shout out to the folks at AquaGuard here for a moment, because AquaGuard going to be able to take good care of you when it comes to some very important things right now. If you see like moldy crawl space down in your home, I want you to understand that moldy crawl space can cause musty odors and sinking floors, and that can be a real problem there for your house. But that's where our friends at AquaGuard can step in with a nationally backed warranty that gives the ultimate protection for your home against water, foundation damage, and then all kinds of other things there as well. Because here in Georgia, the ground conditions here sometimes kind of create the kind of issue that would make a company like, possibly a good solution for you. The foundation of your home is perhaps maybe the most important thing that you're going to have to consider when it comes to your home there. So trust our friends at AquaGuard for a whole lot more on that. Then come out and take a look and tell you what you need to consider. It's aquaguard.net for more on that. It's aquaguard.net for more on that. All right, let's transition here back to Georgia football. And I think it's interesting. As I said before, we're going to close out tomorrow's show by talking about all the really big national games on the horizon. The biggest of them all is the game between Notre Dame and Ohio State. And it's really interesting to me that in this big game, Irish, Buckeyes, both these programs have sort of had Georgia on their mind here a little bit here this week. Ohio State still whining about the Peach Bowl win for Georgia against the Buckeyes that, obviously Marvin Harrison Jr., the terrific wide receiver, got injured during the game. You hate to see that, but no one on the Georgia side is to blame for that. Officials made the correct call in allowing it to be a play that stood. Javon Bullard making a terrific play to result in a prevent a touchdown from being scored. It was the right call. It was a good play. It was an unfortunate circumstance, and it resulted in a Marvin Harrison Jr. injury. But Buckeyes folks apparently can't let it go. Their administration and coaches acting like nothing more than message board posters for the most part during this offseason in the sort of a ceaseless attempt to embarrass themselves. Gene Smith, the Ohio State athletic director, he was quoted this week by Ross Dellinger, the reporter for Yahoo. I'll show this on the screen. So Ohio State's getting ready to play Notre Dame. You'd think their attention would be on that, except Dellinger quotes Gene Smith as saying this week, we could have won a national championship last year if they'd have let Marvin Harrison play, but he had a bad hit. He says that's oversight. Now, I honestly don't know the context of all of this, but the idea that Gene Smith is still whining about Marvin Harrison Jr., very much in keeping with the whininess of Ryan Day, the whininess of Ohio State fans. There was a lot to dislike about the Ohio State Buckeyes, and it starts straight at the top. You can obviously see that there from Gene Smith. But believe it or not, it's not just the Ohio State side that's also thinking a lot about this game on Saturday. The Notre Dame side's apparently thinking the same stuff there too, because the game on Saturday between the Buckeyes and the Irish is also in South Bend at Notre Dame Stadium. Now, it was 6 years ago that Georgia completely took the place over, unlike anything we'd ever seen in college football before. And apparently, according to a story this week at The Athletic, Notre Dame is quite intent on making sure that doesn't happen again, trying to figure out some way to do that. I want to show you a quote from the story here. This from the subscription site known as The Athletic. The game was a classic, with Georgia escaping with a 2019 win when Notre Dame's last gasp drive ended with a strip sack. But, The Athletic says, beyond the loss, the optics for the Irish were a disaster, as a lucrative red wave took over the stadium, bringing back memories of Nebraska's visit to Notre Dame Stadium 17 years earlier. Georgia fans serenaded with the Dogs with "Hail to Georgia" at the start of the fourth quarter, phone flashlights in hand. We all remember that. It was a great scene. I was very, very proud to be a part of that. One of the best sporting memories I'll ever have. And the purpose of the story at the Athletic is the folks at Notre Dame are like, we got to make sure this doesn't happen again, that Ohio State fans don't take over our stadium the same way that Georgia fans did back in 2017. So it's a huge game. It's two of the biggest brands in all of college football. And both Notre Dame and Ohio State this week have both kind of had Georgia on their minds, which gives you a little bit of idea of just how large a shadow that Georgia casts over the entire sport right now, including the very best and games, very biggest programs. Georgia's still a very prominent factor in their minds, even before they both get ready to play a very big game on Saturday. One more shout out before we wrap up here today, that if you've got a loved one that's been hurt or injured in an accident, or you yourself have had the same thing happen to you, when that goes down, you want to be made whole. You want to be properly compensated for what you deal with. And that's where our friends at J. Stein Law Firm become an important name to know, because not only is Josh Stein, double dog, UGA Law School graduate, two-time graduate of the University of Georgia, he's also got more than 20 years experience handling injury cases, perhaps just like the one that you may need to go through here right now. Some of these firms, gigantic, and to them, you're just a number, you're just a file, you're just a name. They don't have any true consideration of what you're all about, but that's not going to be true with Josh Stein and the folks over at the J. Stein Law Firm. They're going to treat you with the personal care that you deserve in the situation that you might be going through. A fellow dog helping other dogs in a time of need. That's what the Josh Stein folks are all about. J. Stein Law Firm. Find them online, jsteinlawfirm.com. That's jsteinlawfirm.com for more on that. All right, a couple of golden shoes to give you on the way out the door here today. Start with Josh Stevens. Now, Josh said this to me a couple of days ago, and sometimes I kind of get a little lost in my Twitter mentions, so I did not see this, but I did see it today, which I was glad I did, because Josh deserves a great shout-out for this. He says, "My firstborn was born today. He came out beating South Carolina." That's awesome to hear. He says he needs a golden shoe for a birthday present. Hashtag newborn dog. Josh Stevens, not hashtag, but congratulations to you for sure. A golden shoe, well-deserved indeed. We just are so proud of you, Josh, and we always appreciate when folks share good news with us. So a well-deserved golden shoe for you and your family and your firstborn son, who's already seen a big Dogs win. You love to see that, Josh. Well-deserved indeed. And finally, a little bit of funny, if not perhaps a little bit mean on my part. The SEC Network shared this on Twitter this week, a picture from the folks at Transfer Portal on Twitter. So it's Nick Saban speaking to his team at the locker room halftime of the game against South Florida. And there's an Alabama staffer having to hold a water cooler in place so Saban can stand on it and address the team, which the joke here from the SEC Network and the Transfer Portal is the guy with the job of kind of holding Saban steady on this water cooler, which is probably a pretty pressure-packed job. But am I rude if we talk for 2 seconds about the fact that Nick Saban needs to stand on a water cooler for his team to see him? Saban, 5'0", however tall that he is. If you want to get an idea of a guy who's just a little bit short, the fact that he's having to stand on the water cooler to be seen by his team, that's maybe not the image you quite want. It's not been a very good year for the Saban mystique. And this picture of having to stand on a water cooler to be seen by the people in the back of the room, that may be kind of the latest, I guess, blemish on the Alabama legacy here right now of Nick Saban. Tough scene there from both the SEC Network and Transfer Portal on Twitter. So with that said, we'll give you a Gator Hater countdown on the way out the door here. We will remind you that the Dogs will be back in Jacksonville coming up. Is it 38 days from now? Let's see. We have a Gator Hater countdown today? Maybe not. Either way, we'll be back in Jacksonville coming up. 30-something days. We'll be there, and we will see you then. Yeah, there we go. 37 days from right now, our Gator Hater countdown. We will see you there for that, and we'll see you back here tomorrow at DawgNation Daily, presented by Meriwether Tharp. And on video, time now for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. R.S. Andrews, the one you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price that's promised. You can trust R.S. Andrews on all of that. We've got a really fun episode of Go With The Flow presented by R.S. Andrews coming up on Friday. We're looking forward to all of that. Just cannot wait for it. All right, I got to plug my computer in, then we'll get your comments. This thing's about to die on me. Every now and then it does. Did it just die? Let's see if it did. No, I got it in. Okay. All right, let me get your comments. We'll roll through here, and then we'll get ready to roll into a Thursday afternoon. Back tomorrow with a big show, kind of getting ready to close out the week. Really excited about Georgia UAB. Really excited about the big weekend. You know, I just can't wait for it. I like these kind of showdown Saturday type things. I like all of that. And on Saturday, we get ourselves one of those. So can't wait for it. All right, your commentary here now. UGA boy for life, Brunetti. Appreciate you being here. Paul Moon says Michigan kind of plays the Georgia game, but with worse talent. I would say that's kind of true. It's one of the reasons why we don't really view Michigan as a real threat to Georgia, because you can't out Georgia by doing what Georgia wants to do. That just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't work. The teams I think nationally that pose a much greater threat to Georgia are perhaps Texas, Florida State. I tell you who's worth watching right now. Keep your eye on Washington. I think Washington's a pretty interesting team here at the moment. I'm not certainly ready to tell you, this is going to be a team that does whatever. Through the first 3 weeks of the season, I believe Washington, pound for pound, can call themselves the most impressive team. Totally destroyed Michigan State last week. I believe some of that on the basis of the Michigan State situation behind the scenes being a real disaster. No one's fully considering what's happening there because people are afraid to talk about it. But there is a disaster unfolding at Michigan State, which I believe makes them pretty bad on the football field in all likelihood, if I had to guess, including this Saturday against a Maryland team that has a history of beating up on bad teams. But nonetheless, Washington still destroyed the Spartans on the field, beat Boise State really bad. I think that's a good win. I think Washington's pretty good. But the point is if you told me who are the national threats to Georgia, keeping it to the teams we sort of expected to be a part of this conversation, it's far more like a Texas-Florida State for me than it is a Michigan-Ohio State. Ohio State, when it comes down to it, will never be physically or mentally tough. They're just not. And Michigan is a little bit too much of a sugar-free version of what Georgia is. So I just don't view them as huge threats on either side. Let's see what else. Let's go, Brandon. Cassie Turner. What did Cassie say? Let me see what Cassie said. I'm just saying that the hope is still scarce even after 2 national titles. The 41-year drought did something to the fan base, I think. Maybe that's the case, Cassie. I understand where you're coming from in terms of, people that want to turn negative pretty quick. And I think there's a couple of things going on when that's the case. There are some people that they were negative during the 2 national championship runs. And I'm not trying to be funny here, and I'm not trying to be like armchair psychologist. There are some people that just have a hard time with the idea of happiness. They have a very low joy ceiling, and they just don't have much capacity for happiness in their life. And I'm hesitant if I want to say this or not. Just really real quick. If you numb all your feelings, you numb the good feelings too. And so when it comes down to it, you just can't feel happiness because you don't feel anything. Just be careful with that. Anyway, but whatever the reason for it is, there are some people who they got a low joy ceiling. They just do. They have a very low opportunity for happiness. And so, I see this because I interact with so many Georgia fans, and I kind of have a little bit of a vantage point of tens upon tens of thousands of Georgia fans who interact with our show. And it's not a huge pocket. It's really not, but it was a small pocket. They weren't happy during the national championship seasons. They were always finding something to be worried about. That's just kind of the nature of some people. They just don't really view happiness as an objective even. They're not even trying to be happy. So there's some of that's out there. But there's also a little bit more benign thing going on sometimes too, which is it's fun to think about complicated problems, interesting problems. And when you see Georgia having something not going well on the football field, it's kind of fun to think about how do you solve that. And when college football fans kind of go down the path of, okay, well, how do you solve this kind of interesting problem of you need to score more points, you need to do this. Sometimes it's, how do you stop so-and-so player, right? those are interesting problems to try to solve. And it's fun to think about that because most of our minds that if we don't think about something, we just kind of race and go somewhere we don't want to go, mentally speaking. So it's fun to replace the thoughts you are having with something that's more interesting to think about, and solving large-scale college football problems in our mind is just kind of a fun thing to consider. And so sometimes what's nothing more than just kind of a cool pastime looks like an argument. You ever see people that don't speak your language, and when you listen to them talking, it sounds like they're arguing because you don't understand the language. But if you were actually able to speak and communicate the language they were speaking, you would realize, oh, they're not arguing at all. They're just animated. I think there's a version of that goes on in college football too, that some of us get so deep in the sport that we're trying to solve what we view as interested and complicated problems related to the sport, that it ends up sounding like an argument because we're animated about the discussion. But ultimately, it's really just an energized discussion about a topic in which we have great passion for. And I really do think that a lot of the stuff as it relates to Georgia coming out the South Carolina game is actually not super negative. It has a negative bent to it because the game for Georgia, I don't think, was all that great. But the actual discussion itself, I don't think is like wildly negative, really hateful. I mean, some people probably take it to a bad place because some people live in a bad place. But I would say that largely speaking, after a game like South Carolina, when there was probably slightly more bad than good for the team overall, some of that's just the nature of, hey, we love this topic, we love diving into it, we want to try to solve all these problems in our head because it's just fun to think about. And I think that's a lot of what goes on. Sorry for the soapbox, but that's kind of my thing there. Let's see what else. Randy Payne, good to see him back here. People have been worried about Randy. He was gone for a couple of days. They say he's ready for the DawgNation Riverboat invasion. Randy, I'm glad to hear that. Paul Moon says, I find all the negativity exhausting. After all of the heartbreak, all of the close but no cigar, this is the best Georgia's ever been. I'm enjoying the high, and it won't last forever. I think that's absolutely the proper perspective. And I think that you can kind of dissect the games in the moment without losing the big picture perspective, which is, here's what I'm going to tell you. At some point in time, we are going to see a Georgia season come to an end without Georgia winning the national championship, whether it happens this year or it happens for the next time 9 years from now. At some point in time, we're going to see Georgia be less than a national championship level team. It's going to happen at some point in time in the future. Distant future, near future, maybe it happens this year right now. When it does, here's what I can promise you my response will be. My response, both publicly, privately, in my head, in my mind, with my words, my response will be to simply say thank you to everyone who made this experience so enjoyable. And I hope it lasts for many, many years to come, and I believe it certainly can last for quite some time to come. But whenever it comes to an end, or whenever it takes a brief pause, because sometimes you see this, right? I mean, Alabama didn't win all of its national championships in a row. If you think that Georgia's got, championships still yet to come, sometimes they come in clusters. You win a couple of here, you take a year off, you win the next one, you take a year off, you win the next one. Sometimes it happens in sports. The Patriots kind of did the same thing where they win one, they take a couple of years off, they come back and win one again. Maybe that is what plays out for Georgia. Or maybe they win two and they never win any more again. That's a possibility there as well. No matter how long it lasts and no matter how many kind of bumps in the road it sort of endures along the way, the overwhelming response for me is going to be gratitude. But it would be boring to come in here every day and just say, oh my gosh, it's so great to be a Georgia fan. Can you believe how great, we've got it? That never stops being true, but you also love your wife all the time too. That never stops being true, but it's not like you just, every sentence out of your mouth is how much you love your wife. Sometimes you talk about something different. And so with college football, I think it's the same way. I never stop being grateful for the experience that Georgia football has provided us over the course of the last couple of years, and the confidence I have that experience is far from done. I never stop being grateful about that. And yet, in the moment, I'm also interested in some other things too. How is this going on? What's happening here? I am interested in facilitating a college football conversation because ultimately that's what it always comes back to for us. Let's see what else. Randy Payne says he's been having some phone issues. Randy, I hate to hear that. I've been having some bad phone stuff there as well. Let's see what else. Taylor Russell says, with so much expectation, it's only natural to have concern after a game like we had versus South Carolina. I think it is absolutely factually accurate and therefore fair to say Georgia did not meet expectations with the way that it played against South Carolina. Now, it is also commendable that in the midst of a pretty bad situation, perhaps self-inflicted, Georgia emerged from that victorious and possibly with some battle scars that make it a better team moving forward. See, there's a whole array of things going on here. But factually true, Georgia played below expectations against South Carolina. And since it's factually true, it's okay to say it out loud. And in addition to that, sometimes a less than stellar performance can lead to better results in the future. Is that what this South Carolina game was for Georgia? I do believe we have to wait and see. We simply don't know. But we will find out. Let's see what else. Thomas Tyson says, y'all wanted this team to face adversity because our schedule is soft. We did and passed. What now? So along those lines, Thomas, I'm going to play a clip tomorrow on the show that Kirby Smart said on, I think it was Monday, and I think it's a really good clip, where he was asked, are you glad that you went through what you went through? And he's like, no, I'm not glad. I want to beat teams so bad that they don't ever want to play the game anymore. And so I think that Smart shared the kind of proper perspective on that, which is, okay, so you maybe theoretically want some adversity because it gives you something to overcome, but ultimately what you really want to be is the kind of team that plays with so much margin, so much cushion, that you just blow right past the idea of adversity. That's really what you want. In other words, and I know not everybody agrees with this, but I'm fairly confident that I'm right. The thing that made Georgia a national champion a year ago was not that it survived a close call against Missouri. The thing that made Georgia a national champion a year ago was the fact that of the 15 games that it played, there were only 2 of those games that reasonably could have even been called a close call. See, college football is a very funny sport. If you leave a game in doubt, eventually something bad's going to happen. Georgia could not win 15 games whether it won this past Saturday. It just can't. That national champions have to pull away from most of the teams that they play. And if you can play most of your games with margin, then you're okay surviving once or twice or a couple of times. But you cannot play every game on kind of a razor's edge. Eventually, bad luck's just going to get you. I mean, it's a dumb cliche, but it is a funny-shaped ball, and it does take funny-shaped bounces. And when a ball gets tipped in the air, who knows where it's going? When a fumble gets dropped, who knows? Do you fall on it? Does your opponent fall on it? Who knows? Who knows? When you allow luck to creep into the story of a football game, anything can happen. But when you're up 17 points, you can have bad luck, and even that won't stop you because you have such a large margin. So while Georgia did overcome adversity on Saturday, and perhaps it makes the story more interesting for the rest of the season, ultimately Georgia's championship success, not just last year, but really the last 2 years, has been built on the back of, hey, this team just throttles so many of the teams that it plays that it actually doesn't leave much room for bad luck to bite it. All right, let me go to Facebook. By the way, I was going to read this earlier. So here's some stats, and I couldn't find this a minute ago. So Kirby Smart after Saturday is going to have the highest winning percentage through 100 games of any coach in SEC history. He says Bear Bryant holds that mark now, 81, 12, and 7. So Smart's going to be better than Bryant after Saturday, at least in this category. Nick Saban's got the record for most wins through the first 100 games. That's 84 and 16. But as we talked about, that's not the start of his coaching career. That's like the final chapter of his coaching career. This is what Kirby Smart's doing from the beginning of his career. And Smart right now, one of just 4 SEC coaches in conference history to win multiple national titles within the first 7 years of a program, which once again for Smart is his first 7 years as a head coach. What an amazing thing. I meant to mention that during the show, and I couldn't find that note a little earlier, but pretty amazing. Okay, on Facebook here. When they pull up. All right, on Facebook. Brandon Griffin says, although you don't want your first taste of adversity to be in the college football playoff, so going through this earlier in the year helps, I believe. Yeah, I mean, you certainly, if you didn't have a Missouri game a year ago, you wouldn't have had anything to call upon when you got to the game against Ohio State. That's true. Now, it's also true that Georgia, I don't think, certainly wanted to play the Missouri game as closely as it did. I mean, having been in the stadium in Como a year ago, Faurot Field, there was a moment in which I thought, gosh, Georgia may really lose this game, which would have just been awful. But they did overcome that. So to Georgia's credit, and that video on the SEC Network, to come back to this again, it's so well done by the network who produced it, but by Georgia who provided the content for the production in terms of what Kirby Smart said, the relaxed nature of that team in halftime. It is not an easy thing necessarily. It is not natural necessarily to be that relaxed when legacies are on the line. And you better believe that a certain part of the Georgia legacy was at stake, losing at the half against South Carolina, and they came right back and won the game. Good to see Matt Rukavina here. It feels like we hadn't seen Matt in a couple of days either. He says, who whines more, Ohio State fans or Tennessee fans? Those people deserve each other. Yeah. You talk about two groups of fans now, sort of a different aesthetic look to them, although similar waistlines, I guess. But those are two fan bases that could certainly spend plenty of time with each other. Very similar. Matt Rukavina says that video that we were talking about won over a lot of recruits. He says some people respond to positivity more so than negativity. Yeah, I mean, so I coach my son's baseball team, and I'm not comparing that to, high-level sports like this, but the one thing I do say to my, including my own son, my kids a lot is that strong muscles or relaxed muscles, that you can't play baseball like really tensed up and nervous. You just can't do that. Sport's hard enough as it is. You don't want to make it harder by being like super tense and super nervous. That putting yourself in kind of a relaxed frame of mind makes you more likely to succeed. So I try to have a relaxed demeanor as a coach. And in college football in the SEC, that's probably not always possible. There are some moments when perhaps you do need to peel paint off the walls. Kirby would know certainly better than I do. And it seems like there are moments when he thinks that, hey, being the absolute most intense version of himself is what's required in that moment. But if I came on the show and always talked the same way, well, eventually you would tune me out because that's just not how real people behave. Sometimes I'm really animated. Sometimes I'm kind of relaxed. Hopefully I kind of have a mood that meets the moment, hopefully. But, coaches are kind of the same way. And I think Matt's right. A lot of players do respond well to that kind of encouragement. They respond well to that kind of belief being instilled into them. And Kirby seemed to call upon the exact right mentality at the exact right moment on Saturday. Fascinating that we got a chance to see the inside there on that. Kevin Cook giving a throwback to Kenny Rogers with the no one to hold him and no one to fold him. Yep. Seems like that's indeed the case. Let's see what else. Bobby Thigpen, by the way, not the former Chicago White Sox closer, but Bobby Thigpen says best wishes to Nick Chubb. May he be mentally as strong as well during this rough time. Yeah, you do hope that for him. You're certainly led to believe that he will be. You certainly believe that he will be, but tough road ahead for him, and that's why DawgNation, I think, is speaking out so heavily in favor of him. Let's see what else. Brett Thompson, thank you for the kind words, Brett. That's an incredibly nice thing to hear. I appreciate that. Joel Moody says, I like this. He says, when the going gets tough, Beck winks. I like that. I'm telling you, it was the wink heard around the world. I think this wink's got some real staying power. I really do. I think this is going to be right there alongside like Kirby Smart popcorn gif and all the stuff. First down gesture against South Carolina a year ago. Kirby's probably I think the two most gifable humans on the planet may very well be Kirby Smart and Leonardo DiCaprio. I feel like DiCaprio's got the most famous gifs of anybody out there right now within the college football realm. I believe that Smart's pretty clearly the most gifable coach. And I think the Beck wink is going to be one that kind of lives on. Gerald Harmon says, kids know how intense coaches are. We dealt with this since Pop Warner. Yeah, there's a lot of that out there. I don't know how much of it works, but there's a lot of that's out there. Miriam Corbin calling for some payback issues against Missouri. I like that, Miriam. I like that indeed. Let's see what else. David Faulkner says, hey, BA, when the Ohio State people whine about the Georgia game, just pivot and tell them we would have won 3 national titles if the refs didn't call offside. There you go, yeah. To this day, Tyler Simmons still on sides. You better believe that's the case. Oh, Kevin Cook. Yeah, that's a good point, Kevin. That the back wink may be the Stetson Bennett drop the mic. That you may be right about that. That may be a very good comparison. Maybe a very good comparison. Randy Hall saying how many sacks on Saturday. This sort of feels like the kind of thing where the Georgia pass rush kind of goes back into its shell a little bit, but I do believe it'll look to get after Auburn next week. Now, if Robbie Ashford's in the game a bunch, that'll probably be more like tackles for loss or just flat tackles, because Ashford runs around so much. Statistically, by the definition of the rule, a little bit hard to get a sack against him. But I believe we'll see a very active pass rush against Auburn next Saturday. If history is our guide, this is not the kind of game in which Georgia's probably quite getting after it quite as much. Peter Wilson, good to talk to you. Thanks so much. Jamie Huff wants to see Carson Beck come out and play from the opening bell. And that's what we talked to Terrence Edwards about a little earlier, which was, I had said I'm not quite so sure that Beck on the field has had his true breakout moment. Terrence said that he disagrees with me, that he feels like the breakout moment was second half against South Carolina last Saturday. Perhaps that's the case. If it is, then it seems like the carryover from that will be seen first half on Saturday against UAB, which is one of the reasons why I am so excited about this game. I am really into Georgia UAB on Saturday in a way that I was not for UT Martin and not for Ball State. Let's see how this team picks up to start a game based on the way that it finished the last game. Could be interesting. Joel Moody mentioning Darius Smith and Jalen Walker. I'm going to agree with both of them. I want to add one more name to the list. So the other day, Darius Smith had a pass rush move that shows you how good he has a chance to be. Now, Mr. Smith is in our comment section from time to time, so we cheer for Darius anyway because of that. But we've liked him as a prospect and player for quite some time. That big long frame, that kind of track style speed that he has, I've seen at least one pass rush move from Smith this year that gives you an idea of just how bright his future could be. So I like him a lot. I totally agree with you on Jalen Walker. Jalen Walker, I believe, is a very good player. I think a guy like that kind of being in kind of a role player situation at Georgia, part of the overall depth, I think that gives you an idea of just how talented Georgia still is on defense. So I think that Walker is, on his way to being a very important player for Georgia, and right now a big part of the overall depth these Dogs have. Another name I'll mention in that category, because, like I said, I saw at least one move from him on Saturday that was just brutal. I'm talking about in a good way. That's Xavier Sorey. I saw a little bit of a spark from Sorey that I liked the other day. So I'd add Sorey into that discussion there too. I think that Georgia's got some really, really interesting edge-type guys. I do. People can talk about not quite having the Jalen Carter in the middle of the field as the interior pass rush this year. That's certainly probably true. And, the kind of impactful middle linebacker that Nakobe Dean was or Roquan Smith was before that, maybe that's true as well. I don't think we've seen the fully operational battle station yet, though, when it comes to what Georgia's eventually going to do off the edge. Marvin Jones didn't play last week. Mikael Williams in the second half was every bit what we think he can be. Jalen Walker, to the extent that you consider him an edge player, Xavier Sorey, to the extent you can kind of consider him an edge player, Darius Smith Jr. I think there's Marvin Jones back healthy from injury. I think there's some interesting talent there on the edge for Georgia. Marshall Fleming says that the clock rules may cause Georgia to want to be a little bit more pressure-oriented on defense, get the ball back. Could be the case. We had a commenter bring this up before the season began. I think it's a really good point, is that we are obviously considering how the clock rules are impacting teams on a game-to-game basis. The games feel different. There are obviously fewer football plays being made. It is going to have an impact on stat lines at the end of the year as well. Some of these benchmark numbers that we think about will probably be a little harder to achieve. And then perhaps teams strategically playing a little bit different means that some stat lines go up because of what you're trying to do. That's an interesting point. Let me go to a DawgNation.com, and then after that, we'll get ready to wrap up. JP on the subject of Kirby Smart not wanting Carson Beck to turn the ball over. If Kirby were here, the one thing that he would probably say to someone like me is, you knucklehead, you worry about all this other stuff, but when we lost to South Carolina in 2019, one of the things that caused that loss were, 3 turnovers that day? Maybe more than that, 3 turnovers that day. So maybe the careful play of avoiding turnovers would actually preserve the opportunity to win. If Kirby was here, he might say that. And if he did, he might be right about that. AJ Ferraro says it might be a while until Kirby surpasses Dooley, but how long until he surpasses Richt? So it Richt 145. So that's 60. That's 60 more wins, right, to get to Richt. So if you want to call a 12-win season, you just on average, you may say, well, Georgia needs to do more than 12 wins, but just on average. So at 12 wins a year, that's 5 more years. If they go for 7-27, I guess that's 4 15-game years of to get you to 60 wins. But somewhere in the next 5 to 6 years, I guess. Does that sound about right? About 5 to 6 years? Yeah, JP says the same thing, about 5 to 6 years. Let's see what else. JP also says, I think that South Carolina was a big first step for Beck, but the kind of final step is winning on the road in a hostile environment against Auburn. I believe that's true. We've been talking about this since almost the beginning of the calendar year, that Auburn, I think, has a real shot to win on Saturday. They're not expected to. They're not favored to, but I think they have a real shot to win that game. And if it does, Jordan-Hare Stadium is going to be allowed probably no matter what for the Georgia game coming in. But if Auburn's undefeated, that's a different kind of thing. And I don't think that changes necessarily how good of a team Auburn is. This may be more about Texas A&M just not being very good. But Jordan-Hare Stadium atmosphere, environment, that's a real thing. That's a real deal. It's the kind of thing that Georgia very much has to be on guard for and ready for. I believe that's true. Brandon Griffin says that we're living through the best era of both Georgia football and perhaps Braves baseball there as well. There's a case to be made for that, because the commonality here is that while it seems like Kirby Smart's kind of just getting started with his coaching career, when you look at the long-term contracts for so many of the Braves' best players, I think we're led to believe this run for them is going to perhaps go on for a long time too, because the stability you have with so much of your, 1 through 8 position players kind of locked up, that gives you flexibility to kind of do what you want to do with your pitching. You don't have to make a whole lot of risky decisions there on that. Right now, the Braves farm system is not very deep, but as it becomes a little deeper, you can either cultivate your own, stars on the mound. You can use some of those assets to trade for other guys. That the Braves could be, much like we think that the Kirby era here at Georgia could be rolling on for many years into the future. There's a very strong possibility the same thing is true for the Atlanta Braves as well. Randy Hall says Saban's working on an NIL deal with Lucky Charms. Yeah, he's not much taller than that leprechaun. That's about right. He's not much taller than that leprechaun. Standing on that water cooler, that's not a great look. Nature Gator worried about the Braves pitching the playoffs. That's fair. The postseason's a crapshoot as it is. Jesse Chavez coming back yesterday, I think that's a pretty big deal. No one can guarantee playoff success in baseball. It's a totally different animal. But I have no problem with the Braves going into October with this kind of team. I said early in the year, this is the most fun Braves team to watch in my lifetime. I don't believe it's the best. I think the 96 Braves were probably the best team that I've seen. That team obviously did not win the World Series, but I believe the 96 Braves is probably the best Braves team in my lifetime. This is the most fun team to watch. And I'll take the explosive potential of this offense, putting pressure on somebody else's pitching staff. I'll take my shot with that and let the chips fall where they may. Paul Moon says we should make it to noon. No, we got to go here. We got to go. Anything else? Thomas Tyson, we'll make this our last comment. He says, as long as Ladd is hurt, Ra-Ra is going to get plenty of run this season. I meant to mention this earlier, and I've mentioned it before. I know I said it on the post-game show on Saturday. It was very telling to me that when Georgia needed to upgrade and kind of spread out its passing attack on Saturday. Ra got a lot of touches. Dominic Lovett got a lot of touches. That's very interesting to me. These are SEC veterans. And Ra played Mississippi State a year ago in a very different kind of offense. He's probably got a lot to learn here at Georgia. You would be led to believe he does. Very, very, challenging transition to offenses that are completely different. But that's a football player. And he made some big catches. Dominic did there as well. Kirby calls them running plays. I don't care about the semantic nonsense on that. That's not interesting to me. Either way, it's a touch that resulted in positive yards. And it's very, very intriguing to me how involved that both Ra and Lovett were in the second half of that game. That gives you an idea they're going to be a part of the story, I believe, for Georgia down the stretch. It was kind of a cool thing to see. All right, we got to go. Senior Dog 54 says Acuna's stats, maybe a top 5 season over the last 50 years. I agree with that. I know the dorks want to tell you that Mookie Betts got a better WAR than Acuna does. I honestly don't care. What Acuna is doing right now is mesmerizing. It really is mesmerizing. So I love to see it. And Senior Dog, I think you're right about that. Your historical perspective, I believe, is probably spot on. Kevin Cook, Scotty Barnes, blessed day to both of you guys there as well. Let's see what else. All right, we got to go. All right, good stuff. Thanks for being here. Go check out RS Andrews online, rsandrews.com for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. Water heater, if it goes out, RS Andrews can replace it for you. Many cases the same day. So don't have your weekend ruined by a water heater that's on the blink, on the fritz. What do you say when something goes out? Either way, don't let that weekend get ruined by a bad water heater. Get it replaced. Many cases the same day from our friends at RS Andrews. So find them online at rsandrews.com for more on that. And then tomorrow, we are very energized about Georgia UAB. The weekend, we're going to call it our own showdown Saturday, whether ESPN still does that kind of stuff or not. Going to be a great time. We will talk to you about it tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by Meriwether Tharp. We'll look forward to talking to you then.